This video was made in partnership with Hasselblad. The city sleeps, but my shutter doesn't. In fact, as the last light fades and the world settles into darkness, my camera becomes alive. In this video, we'll explore the art of night photography, balancing long exposures, mastering low light settings, and finding the perfect compositions hidden in the darkness. I'll share practical tips and creative tricks that will turn ordinary scenes into cinematic moments. So grab your tripod, dial in those settings, and get ready to see the night in a whole new light.
Hi guys, welcome to another video. Tonight we're in the city of Cologne, and as you might see and hear, the city is very much alive at night. It's very colorful, there's a lot of sounds going on, a lot of lights going on, a lot of people on the streets and a lot of nice scenes, also a lot of neon lights. So tonight I'm here with the Hasselblad 907X, my weapon of choice, which I will use exclusively in the panoramic crop mode. The crop mode is also called Hasselblad XPAN mode because it's kind of reminiscent of one of the most iconic cameras out there, the Hasselblad XPAN, that I'm very grateful to own, and I've shot it a couple of times in night situations like this. So tonight I'm gonna see if this camera can actually be considered the digital counterpart to the Hasselblad XPAN, and if we can kind of blend in the look between my XPAN shots and these ones here. So a quick disclaimer, this video was actually made in partnership with Hasselblad, but it's not a technical review. I'm going to use this camera tonight to try it out for night photography, but basically Hasselblad just told me to do whatever I want to do and just shoot my regular style of video. So tonight I'm going to work on my series of liminal spaces and see if maybe we can also find some portfolio shots. However, I will also tell you a couple of useful things that you should know when taking photos at night, not only technical regarding the settings and everything you should know about night photography, but also some stylistic things you should look out for when being in this kind of situation at night. So without any further ado, let's shoot.
I'm using the Hasselblad 907X in this video, but of course you can use any camera you want and are familiar with. The only thing that's pretty crucial is that the camera has manual features and you can dial in your settings yourself. And I would say that this is probably the most important technical advice, that the right camera settings are key for night photography. The holy trinity of ISO, shutter speed and aperture influence your outcome significantly, and that's very noticeable in night photography, where we deal with more extreme conditions and little available light.
As for the ISO, I would recommend to stick as close as possible to base ISO, which on the Hasselblad is ISO 64, because this will introduce the least amount of noise. And for the aperture, I like to step down my lens, so I usually like to go to something like f8 or f11, because this gives us focus in the several layers within a frame. And naturally, because we are dealing with low ISO and stop-down lenses, we have to adjust the shutter speed accordingly. So usually I have longer shutter speeds, somewhere between 1 second to 30 seconds. And I have to say that here on the Hasselblad, it's pretty easy to set all of your settings manually, because this is probably the most intuitive and most visually pleasing camera menu I ever encountered. So these are basically the settings that I like to use for night photography. And see if we can get something. That doesn't look too bad. So tip number one might sound obvious, but it's not, because you should use a tripod. I mean, of course, you can shoot handheld, do whatever you want, but for the type of night photography that I like to do, where we kind of have the contrast of movement and stillness, a tripod is very useful because you get rid of camera shake due to like shaky hands, and also make movement visible, as for example light streaks and moving subjects just blurring out. So I feel a tripod is kind of an essential for night photography. One thing that's also very, very important is to not just trigger the camera, but if you're shooting film, use a cable release. If you're shooting digital, either use a self-timer, 2 seconds is enough, but just anything that doesn't touch the camera and introduce any type of shake. You can also use an app to trigger your camera, but just avoid touching your camera, so manual settings are key. It's kind of a given as well, but we talked about manual settings, and it goes without saying that also autofocus is something you should rather turn off and focus manually. On the Hasselblad, I think it was solved very, very nicely with the manual focus, because all you have to do is kind of push the ring of the lens this direction, and then you can manually focus, and you get like this green indicator once the frame or the spot you selected is in focus, which is way quicker than the traditional type of focus peaking. So yeah, don't trust your camera when it comes to autofocus, because in the night, in the shadows, it can get a little bit wonky at times. So here we have the XPAN mode, which is amazing that it's called like that. 65:24. Another tip is to really look out for the compositions in your aspect ratio. I'm shooting panorama tonight. Oi. Which means that not every composition, not every frame would work in a panoramic aspect ratio. In a 2:3 or 1:1 crop, you look out for different compositions. So tonight I'm going to look for more spread out compositions with more elements in the frame to just enhance the aspect ratio. It's kind of a given that you need to think and visualize in the aspect ratio that you selected. With the Hasselblad, I actually quite like that you get to see what's outside of the aspect ratio you selected. So it's not completely cropped out, but it's not blacked out. You can see what you're missing, and this definitely helps to kind of align the frame in the perfect manner. So that's my frame. Another thing I really like to look out for, in general with photography, but also for night scenes, is symmetry. Because symmetry and the break of symmetry can trigger this very uncomfy type of feeling, this ambivalent feeling of having like a nice balanced composition, but then having this break of it. So you have kind of this harmony, but also the imbalance, and I really like to play with these elements. And here, for example, is a good example, because we have this symmetry on both sides, but then the orange pillar in the middle kind of breaks it. So I feel like looking out for symmetry, but also for breaks in symmetry, is a very good aspect to look out for when doing night photography. So this might not look like much, but honestly I think it's one of the most interesting things, because I discovered when shooting night photography that one of my core interests are liminal spaces. And per definition, liminal spaces are transitional spaces in between two states. So usually if you go somewhere, you start somewhere and you have a destination, and everything on that way can be considered a liminal space. So typical examples are something like garages, train stations, waiting rooms, and these are spaces that you usually don't go to as your destination, but they are transitional spaces because you want to go somewhere else. And I found that these places, especially at night, evoke a very ambiguous and very eerie feeling. So I feel like playing with these emotions is very helpful. So definitely don't overlook scenes that you might quickly brush off or pass on in daytime. Junge, ist das nice. So what we have to take into account is that we're dealing with artificial light sources, so we have to Think about that when setting our white balance. I like to set either the tungsten or the fluorescent setting because this will help to have this cinematic, eerie kind of feel and vibe straight out of camera without actually needing to do much editing. Another stylistic element I like to look out for when shooting at night is color contrasts. So this car is red, but with the settings of having a tungsten balanced light, the background will appear more blue. So having contrast, like for example color contrast, complementary contrast, looking for something colder, something warmer, always looks great. So this is for example a scene I try to not overlook. So one thing I also like to look out for when doing night photography is to integrate human elements. This scene, even though we don't have humans in the frame, show human things, and usually human traces are what evokes emotions. We have something that's familiar to us, which kind of transports comfort, but at the same time, by shooting at night and by showing them in a context without people, it might evoke this eerie feeling, and the clash of something comfortable and this discomfort I think is very interesting and is elevated at night. So look for human traces, even though you might not capture people in the frame. Another thing that's very popular for good reasons are reflections. I think they are very interesting because you can create complex subject matters. So if you see, for example, a glass window, the entrance to a shop, a billboard or a mirror or whatever, see if you can create something with that, because it kind of creates this contrast between the inside and the outside, which can be very interesting. So reflections are always interesting to look out for at night. So these were a handful of tips that I hope will be helpful the next time you approach night photography. And I know that night photography can be intimidating because we're dealing with pretty tough conditions and low light where you have to set your settings intentionally. But I hope that once we have all the technical aspect out of the way, that you can enjoy night photography as something that's worth experimenting with. Because it's just like a big blank canvas where you can experiment with things like motion and stillness, human traces, and also the contradicting emotions that are evoked at night. And a message that I oftentimes get are people who say that they're kind of bored of the place they live and that they don't have anything to shoot. And I feel you on that one because I've been there before. But I think that night photography is something that can be very interesting for that, because in the night everything looks different. Even the boring, mundane, familiar places you've seen 1,000 of times just look so different at night. So if you feel stuck, definitely try to, gain a new perspective by going out and shooting in these conditions. And as for the Hasselblad 907X, I have to say that this was a pure joy to shoot, and it was amazing to use it in the Hasselblad XPAN crop mode, because the results I got are actually pretty close to my Hasselblad XPAN film images I got, which is rather surprising, but I feel like the 10-bit color out of this thing just look amazing and stunning. So all the images you see here were barely touched by me. I just put maybe a little bit of grain over them, but other than that, it's pretty much straight out of camera. So for me, this might not be the next digital XPAN because, the systems are so far from another. The XPAN being a rangefinder film camera and this one being a mirrorless modular medium format digital camera. But still, I feel like both of them are brave cameras that really, really help to think outside of the box and shoot in a different way than probably most cameras would allow you to do. And that being said, I would say thank you for watching and see you in the next episode.